Welcome back, dear listeners. Tonight, I invite you into one of history's deepest wounds. A mystery so old, yet so strangely alive, that even now it refuses to settle into silence. Imagine an entire community, more than 100 men, women, and children, rising with the sun each morning, tending gardens, cooking meals, arguing, laughing, dreaming. And then one day, every single heartbeat disappears. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just footprints fading in the sand, and a ghostly quiet that feels less like abandonment and more like erasure. If history has a cold case that still breathes, it's this one. And tonight, we open it. The year is 1587. The place? A slender stretch of land off the coast of what would one day be North Carolina. The English called it Roanoke Island, a place of dense forests, shifting sands, and winds that never stopped whispering. To many of the settlers, it felt like the world's edge, a land where familiar rules seemed to dissolve, and strange new rhythms, new dangers, and new spirits took over. The trees groaned at night, the waves crashed with an eerie persistence, and yet this lonely, wild island held something powerful: hope. For these settlers, Roanoke was meant to be the beginning of a New England, a foothold in a vast land the English desperately wished to claim. Their governor, John White, was a practical man, careful, observant, perhaps too cautious to thrive in a world where every decision meant life or death. But he had one thing no other governor had: a personal stake. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, and his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, were both among the colonists. Virginia became the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of promise, of permanence, of a future. And yet that future would prove painfully brief. At first, the colony struggled. Food was scarce. Relations with local tribes fluctuated between uneasy trade and sharp hostility. The land fought them with every step: storms that swallowed their crops, tides that eroded their paths, forests thick enough to hide an army. Still, they endured. They built houses, tended small gardens near the shore, even held christenings and celebrations. By firelight, they told each other they would survive, that this strange land would bend to them eventually. They believed England would return with supplies, soldiers, comfort. But England, like the sea, is a promise that can turn cold. In late 1587, the colonists begged John White to sail home and bring back provisions. They knew the risks. The Atlantic was a graveyard of broken masts and forgotten dreams, but starvation was closer, more immediate. White agreed, reluctantly. He kissed his daughter goodbye, touched the soft cheek of his granddaughter, and promised to return swiftly.
He intended to, but the world had other plans. When White reached England, he found a nation on the brink. War with Spain was erupting, and the Spanish Armada loomed like a steel shadow across the sea. All ships, even private ones, were seized for the defense of the realm. White begged, pleaded, cried, but no one would allow him passage. The sea, once his path home, became a locked gate. The months stretched longer, then the years, 3 of them. 3 years that blurred seasons, frayed memories, and choked hope. 3 years during which the colonists of Roanoke would be left utterly alone on the edge of a continent that did not want them there. What had happened? White asked himself that question every night. Did they starve? Were they killed? Had they moved? Had they survived? He'd replay his daughter's smile, his granddaughter's small hands, and wonder if he'd ever see them again, or if he'd already failed them forever. Finally, in 1590, he secured passage. A battered ship, a risky mission, but it didn't matter. The Atlantic tossed them like a toy. Storms carved foam from the sea, But White only cared about one thing: reaching Roanoke before all traces of his people vanished. Each sunrise over the endless water felt like a question he didn't want answered. When they arrived at the Outer Banks, the coastline looked wrong. The sandbars had shifted. The familiar shore where he'd once stepped onto the island looked twisted, reshaped by storms. They lowered small boats and rowed toward the beach. The closer they came, the more dread slid beneath his ribs. Something was off, too quiet. Not the natural quiet of wilderness, but an absence like the air was holding its breath. White and his men pushed through the trees toward the settlement. Every step felt heavier. The path that had once been beaten down by daily footsteps was overgrown. Branches hung low. Weeds choked the trail. The forest had begun reclaiming what humanity had left behind. When they reached the village clearing, the world stopped moving. The houses were gone, but not destroyed, dismantled, carefully taken apart as though the colonists had planned to build them somewhere else. No collapsed beams, no signs of fire, no splintered wood. Just empty foundations and grass growing where beds had once stood. There were no bodies, no bones, no torn clothing or broken tools. The colonists' chests and trunks were opened, but not looted. It was as though the contents had been inspected, removed selectively, then closed again with eerie neatness. White walked slowly, his hands shaking as he touched the earth. The ashes of the forge lay cold, untouched for years. Rain barrels sat empty, dry, their wooden sides cracking. Gardens were overrun, wild and tangled.
But the strangest emptiness of all was one White felt rather than saw. It was as though whatever life had existed here had been sucked out, leaving only a shell, a ghost of a place. He called out, for Eleanor, for Virginia, for anyone, but only the wind answered. The surrounding woods watched quietly, tall and indifferent. Beyond the settlement, they found footprints, not fresh ones, merely indentations, half erased by storms and time. Too chaotic to read, too many layers of shoes and bare feet to identify. Whoever had left hadn't fled. They had walked, calmly, deliberately, as if they knew where they were going. As White moved further into the clearing, he felt the old sensation of being observed, not by ghosts, but by the land itself. Roanoke was not empty. It was waiting. It felt ancient, stern, patient. A place that had seen more than one group of humans vanish, a place that would see many more. The men spread out. They searched the perimeter. They checked the shoreline, hoping for signs of boats. But the small boats were gone. Taken, not stolen, taken by the colonists themselves. They had chosen to leave. But where? And why? White stood near a tall tree at the edge of the settlement, staring at a faint groove in the wood. It was the first hint that the colonists hadn't disappeared blindly. They had left something behind, a message, a clue carved into the world. He moved closer. The letters were crude, weathered, but unmistakable. C-R-O-A. But that discovery must wait until the next chapter. For now, we linger on this moment. John White, surrounded by the echoes of people he loved, staring into a village that had become a mausoleum without bodies. The ocean roared beyond the trees, and the wind tugged at his clothes like a child whispering a warning. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, too suddenly, too sharply, and even the sailors froze.
Roanoke was no longer simply abandoned. It was unnatural. That night, the men refused to sleep on the island. They camped on their ship, staring at the dark silhouette of the trees. Lantern light flickered across the water. The forest seemed to pulse, alive, restless, and all of them, Even the bravest felt the weight of something unseen pressing against their thoughts, a dread not born of imagination, but of instinct. The same instinct that tells animals when a predator is near. John White lay awake, his eyes fixed on the distant shore. He pictured Eleanor singing near the fire. He imagined Virginia's small fingers wrapped around his. He imagined laughter, arguments, life. And then he imagined footsteps, those last footsteps, disappearing into the trees. What had followed them? Hunger? Fear? War? Something else? Or had they gone willingly? As dawn began to tug at the horizon, a single truth remained. Whatever happened to the colony of Roanoke did not happen suddenly. It happened silently. And silence, history teaches us, is far more terrifying. The morning light crept over Roanoke like a hesitant visitor, dim and gray, as if even the sun questioned whether it should illuminate a place so weighed down by unanswered stories. On the deck of the anchored ship, John White watched the island with sleepless eyes. The wind scraped against the wooden rails, whispering through the rigging like a restless spirit pacing back and forth. His men avoided his gaze. They had all seen the emptiness on shore the previous day, and the collective shock hung over them like a pall. But White felt something else, an ache of familiarity. Even in its silence, Roanoke was the last place where his daughter had walked, the last place her granddaughter had cried or laughed, the last place where his family had existed in the world. And so, despite the dread that had crept into their bones, he ordered the men to lower the boats again. They returned to the island, stepping onto the damp sand with heavy boots and heavier hearts. The settlement greeted them with the same unnatural stillness. Birds chirped in the distance, but none dared to land near the abandoned village. The trees swayed, but nothing in the clearing moved. It felt as if the world had frozen mid-breath, not in death, but in anticipation. White walked ahead of the others, retracing his steps from the day before. His eyes drifted across the ruins, foundations where houses once stood, the hollow pit where the communal fire had once burned, the scattered refuse of everyday life left behind without explanation. Then he saw it again, the faint groove in the wooden post. He approached it slowly, his pulse pounding in his ears. With trembling fingers, he brushed away a clinging moss and revealed the carving in full. Croatoan. The word was crude, but deep, etched into the wood with deliberate, steady strokes. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. It was purposeful.
White stared at it for a long time, as though hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into a full explanation. Croatoan. It was the name of a nearby island, and also the name of a people, a friendly tribe located on what we now call Hatteras Island. Many of the colonists had interacted with them. Some traded goods, some even developed friendships. And crucially, before leaving 3 years earlier, White had told the settlers to carve a cross beneath any message if they were in danger. But there was no cross. No symbol of distress, no plea for rescue. Only a single word hanging in the air like a final, unfinished sentence. The sailors clustered behind him, muttering theories under their breath. One insisted the colonists must have relocated to Croatoan Island. Another feared the word was a lure, bait carved by an enemy who wanted to draw the English into a trap. A third man, more superstitious than the rest, whispered that Croatoan was not merely a place, but a spirit, an omen spoken of by indigenous tribes, something older than English letters and too real to ignore. White ignored their chatter. His mind raced.
If the colonists had willingly moved, why hadn't they waited? Why hadn't they left a more detailed message? Why dismantle their homes so carefully only to vanish into the wilderness without a trace? And why, above all else, had not a single object been left overturned, broken, or scattered? The settlement was too clean, too neat. The absence of chaos made the silence more violent. He led the men deeper into the village. They searched for more markings, following the faint hints of old paths through the underbrush. Then, near the edge of the former fort, they found another carving. This one was partially obscured by vines, but unmistakable. The letters Crow carved into a tree trunk. It seemed to confirm the first message. It also meant the colonists had time to leave two signs, implying calm, deliberate action. But why two? Why repeat the message unless they feared the first might be missed? White felt a haunting thought snake through his mind. What if the colonists had tried to flee somewhere else first? What if CRO marked their initial path and Croatoan marked a second decision, a change in direction? Or worse, a correction forced by something in the forest? The sailors spread out, searching the tree line for more clues. They found a few scattered footprints, but the ground had long since warped them into vague impressions. Some prints looked smaller, the kind made by a child. That realization caused several men to fall silent.
White swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. His granddaughter's footsteps could be somewhere beneath the layers of sand and time. As they searched, a sudden gust of wind tore through the trees, and for a moment the forest seemed to hiss. Dry leaves spiraled upward, dancing wildly before scattering like frightened birds. The air grew colder, unnaturally so. One sailor muttered that the island was watching them again. Another refused to step any farther into the woods. White forced himself onward. His duty was too great, his guilt too deep. He walked past the edges of the abandoned settlement, following a faint trail that led toward the interior of the island. The trees grew denser here. The canopy above trapped the light, suffocating the sun until the world faded into a muted green gloom. The air smelled of wet earth and long-decayed leaves. The silence thickened. Then he saw something strange, a ring of scorched earth hidden among the trees. The burn marks were old, the grass struggling to grow back. It wasn't large enough to be a campfire. It was too precise, too circular, almost ritualistic. White crouched and touched the soil. It crumbled beneath his fingers, like ash. "What is this?" one of the sailors whispered. White had no answer. They found no bones, no abandoned tools, nothing to suggest this was part of the colony's survival efforts. It felt like an echo from some other event, something the colonists might have stumbled upon or something they created out of desperation. One sailor insisted the circle was a sign of witchcraft. Another claimed it looked like a signal fire meant to attract a passing ship. But White knew neither explanation fit. Whatever had burned here had burned hot and long, yet no charred wood remained, no remnants of a structure. It was as though the fire had risen directly from the earth. They left the circle behind, unsettled. As they returned to the settlement clearing, the sailors grew restless. One complained of headaches. Another said he felt watched. A third insisted he'd heard footsteps in the brush, even though no one was there. The forest pressed against them like a living wall. When the group gathered again near the carved post, the mood had changed. The men were convinced that the message on the wood was not just a clue, it was a warning. White, however, saw it differently. He clung to the belief that the colonists had gone to Croatoan Island voluntarily. But a deeper question gnawed at him. What had forced them to go? Roanoke had been defensible. The colonists had farms, wells, and homes. They wouldn't have left without significant cause.
And yet the dismantling of their settlement suggested careful planning, not panic. The sailors began arguing. Some wanted to leave immediately, claiming the island was cursed. Others urged White to sail to Croatoan Island. But the weather was turning. Clouds bunched on the horizon like bruises. The wind shifted direction, carrying the metallic taste of an approaching storm. White knew that the shallow waters around the Outer Banks were treacherous. A storm could splinter their ship like driftwood. Still, the thought of leaving without searching Croatoan filled him with dread. His daughter could be alive. His granddaughter might be waiting for him, small hands clutching a stranger's clothes, asking when her grandfather would return. As the men argued, a sudden crack of thunder rolled across the sky. Lightning slashed through the clouds, illuminating the clearing for a brief, blinding moment. In that instant, White swore he saw movement at the edge of the tree line, a flash of pale color like cloth, vanishing between the trunks. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the figure was gone. The sailors saw nothing, but they felt the shift. The air tingled with electricity. The storm drew closer by the second. "We must leave," one sailor shouted. White hesitated. The word carved in the wood seemed to stare back at him, demanding to be understood. Croatoan. It was hope and terror intertwined. They ran back to the boats as rain began to fall, heavy and sudden, like a curtain dropping over the scene. The sky darkened unnaturally fast. Waves pounded the shore, and by the time they reached the ship, the storm had transformed the sea into a wild, churning maw. They raised anchor, fighting to keep the ship from smashing against the sandbars. The rain battered the deck, lightning struck the water with a hiss. Through the chaos, White stared back at the island, the faint silhouette of the trees, the ghostly outline of the abandoned settlement, the thought of that carved word pulsing in the darkness.
The storm raged for hours. By dawn, the sea had calmed, but the damage to their ship was severe. The mast was cracked, rigging snapped. The hull had taken in water. Sailing to Croatoan would now be nearly impossible. White stood on deck, soaked and exhausted, feeling the crushing weight of fate pressing against him. He had come so far, suffered so much, only to be pushed back by something as simple and as unstoppable as a storm. His men muttered that it was a sign. The island did not want them to find answers. But White wasn't ready to accept that. He stared at the horizon, where Croatoan Island lay hidden behind miles of treacherous waters and shifting sands. If the colonists had gone there, he needed to follow. If they had died, he needed to know. And if they had vanished again, he needed to understand why. As the ship sailed away from Roanoke, leaving the empty settlement behind, one truth settled over White like a shroud. The carved word was not the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning. Centuries later, when the forest had reclaimed nearly every trace of the vanished colony, when the wind had carried away the settlers' footprints and blown sand across their hearthstones, when even their descendants had stopped telling stories about the English who once lived among them, a new kind of explorer arrived at Roanoke. They did not come with muskets or prayer books or dreams of empire. They came with shovels, notebooks, and questions sharpened by time. And unlike John White, they did not hope to find living colonists. They hoped to find anything at all. Archaeologists stepped onto the island like doctors examining a corpse long gone cold.
The air around Roanoke still carried that same uneasy quiet. Even in modern times, even with motorboats humming in the distance and tourists snapping pictures nearby, the place felt wrong. Too still, too suspended, as though the ground itself remembered what happened here and chose silence over explanation. The first digs began in the late 1800s, but they were careless, impatient, driven more by treasure hunting than truth. Amateur diggers overturned graves, plundered native burial sites, and seized pottery shards without recording their locations. Much of what they found was lost to private collectors. What could have been clues were tossed aside like scraps. Roanoke resisted explanation not only through mystery, but through human greed. But in the early 20th century, the first serious, calculated excavations began. These researchers examined the landscape like detectives at a long-abandoned crime scene. They mapped soil patterns, tracked disturbances, cataloged every fragment of pottery, iron, and flint, and slowly they began piecing together a picture, one that didn't solve the mystery, but deepened it. They found traces of English presence, but not enough to indicate a massacre. They found remnants of native tools, but not enough to prove assimilation. They found broken ceramics, iron nails, bits of armor, but none lay where they should have. Everything seemed scattered across the island like memories torn from context and flung into the earth. The more they dug, the less logical Roanoke became.
Then came the drought evidence. Scientists studying ancient tree rings, a discipline unknown in John White's time, discovered that the late 1500s brought the worst drought in 800 years to the region. Rainfall dropped, crops failed, rivers shrank. By the time John White sailed back to England, his people had likely been facing starvation on a scale they'd never anticipated. This revelation reframed everything. A starving colony is a desperate colony. A desperate colony does unpredictable things. But starvation alone didn't explain the absence of bodies, the dismantled houses, or the careful message. So the archaeologists kept digging. In the early 2000s, new evidence emerged at what became known as Site X, roughly 50 miles inland. It wasn't a settlement, not exactly, more like a camp, a place where a small group might have stayed temporarily. The objects found there were unmistakably English. A fragment of a slate writing tablet, a ceremonial gun lock, and pieces of pottery matching those brought by the Roanoke settlers. It was as if a portion of the colony had splintered off and attempted to rebuild far from the coast. But the site told a strange story. The English objects were scattered among native artifacts from different centuries. Nothing was layered chronologically. The evidence didn't unfold like a timeline, it collided like debris from a storm. It was as if the past refused to stay still, blurring into one tangled narrative. Then came Site Y, even more perplexing. Located on Hatteras Island, the place the Croatoan tribe called home, archaeologists discovered European copper rings, gun parts, and a hilt from a rapier, all from the correct time period. More importantly, they found shards of pottery belonging to the Roanoke colonists. But again, the distribution was chaotic. The items weren't clustered as one would expect from a relocated colony. They were scattered, exchanged, passed from hand to hand like rumors made solid. Some archaeologists believe this meant the colonists had integrated with native tribes, adopting their customs and burying their European belongings when they no longer held meaning. Others argued the objects were traded, not lived with, proof of interaction, not habitation. Still others insisted the strangest truth: the distribution was too disorderly, too arbitrary, indicating not assimilation but collapse. A group that had splintered, wandered, merged, separated, and possibly died in fragments. And yet none of these interpretations felt complete.
There were no foundations of houses, no long-term structures, no graves matching English burial customs. It was as though the colonists had dissolved into the land rather than lived upon it. What puzzled archaeologists most was the absence of violence. There were no mass graves, no charred remains of buildings, no signs of siege or slaughter. The artifacts told of struggle, yes, but not war, not sudden annihilation. Instead, they hinted at something slower, a pressure that built over months or years, not hours. Something that drove the colonists not into battle, but into disappearance. During one dig, a seasoned researcher paused over a peculiar discovery, a shard of pottery with a faint, almost ghostly engraving. It was a simple mark, just a crosshatch pattern, but something about it felt intentional. The design didn't match traditional English motifs, nor did it resemble local native artwork. It looked like something born of two worlds, an artistic hybrid created by someone who no longer belonged entirely to either. The archaeologist held it for a long moment, turning it in the light, imagining the hands that made it, hands that might have once clutched a baby named Virginia Dare, hands worn from fear, hunger, and hope. The more archaeologists uncovered, the more they realized that Roanoke wasn't a single mystery. It was many mysteries braided together. Each clue pointed in a different direction. Each artifact told a different version of events. The truth was not linear. It didn't march forward. It circled, twisted, drifted like sand dunes shaping and reshaping under the coastal winds. Modern science added yet another layer. Advanced soil analysis revealed that parts of Roanoke Island had once flooded unexpectedly, long before modern maps recorded the shifting tides. Saltwater intrusion may have poisoned wells. Eroding shorelines may have washed away key structures. Some researchers theorized that the colonists, watching their homes sink into marsh and water, had no choice but to abandon the coast. Their careful dismantling of the houses could have been an attempt to salvage materials before nature reclaimed everything. Still, none of this explained the eerie neatness of the empty settlement, the missing bodies, the carved word, the strange burn ring in the forest, or why multiple groups, if indeed multiple groups existed, seemed to leave traces in different directions at roughly the same time. Some archaeologists whispered a different theory, one they hesitated to publish. The colony didn't fall apart because of starvation, conflict, or the environment alone. It fell apart because of fear. Fear leaves fewer traces than violence. Panic scatters people in ways archaeology struggles to reconstruct. If the colonists had split into factions, some wanting to integrate with native tribes, some wanting to push inland, some wanting to sail north or south along the coast, the evidence would look exactly like what was found: fractured, inconsistent, chaotic.
Fear explains the hurried messages, the half-finished carvings, the abandoned tools, the sudden dismantling of homes, the absence of graves, the scattering of possessions across miles of land. Fear, not of a particular enemy, but of everything. One archaeologist described Roanoke not as a disappearance, but as a slow unraveling, a colony that unwound thread by thread until nothing remained but the memory of what had once been whole. Yet even that interpretation left questions. How could more than 100 people vanish so completely that not a single contemporary document recorded their fate? How could they split into factions, yet leave no clear trail for John White to follow? How could even children, dozens of them, disappear without leaving behind so much as a bone? One researcher stared at a spread of artifacts arranged carefully on a table and said softly, "It's like they walked into a fog and kept walking." Scientific investigations continued into the 21st century using ground-penetrating radar, chemical residue analysis, and advanced dating techniques.
Each new effort uncovered something small, something intriguing, but nothing definitive. Roanoke resisted answers with the same determination it had resisted the colonists themselves. Yet even the strangest discoveries were not physical, they were stories. Descendants of local tribes recounted tales their ancestors whispered, stories of pale strangers who arrived starving, desperate, and frightened. Stories of children with yellow hair who clung to native women like surrogate mothers. Stories of settlers who died of sickness, of violence, of heartbreak. Stories of others who lived on, drifting from tribe to tribe, leaving behind only echoes. But stories are delicate things. They bend, blur, change with each telling. And Roanoke's story, more than any other, has become a tapestry of overlapping voices, English, indigenous, scientific, and speculative, each weaving a different thread into the mystery. As archaeologists continued their work, one truth became undeniable. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony was not a singular event. It was a process. A long, painful, complicated process shaped by hunger, fear, weather, conflict, and choices made in desperation. And yet, for all the scientific advances, one question still hovered in the shadows, unanswered. Why did they leave together? No signs of internal violence, no bodies, no clear evidence of a breakpoint. If fear had fractured them, why did the entire settlement vanish rather than crumble piece by piece? Why did they leave such orderly homes? Why carve a message at all? The archaeologists could not answer this, not fully.
Because for all their expertise, all their tools, all their careful excavations, they could not access the one thing that mattered most: the last days of the colony, the final nights. The moment when someone, or everyone, decided to walk away. That part of the story remains buried not in soil, but in silence. And silence, as Roanoke has always shown, is the hardest layer to dig through. For all the gentle theories of migration, cooperation, and gradual dissolution, there exists another layer to the Roanoke mystery, a layer most historians hesitate to touch, not because it lacks evidence, but because it whispers of a darker truth buried beneath polite explanations and academic restraint, a truth that suggests the colonists may not have vanished peacefully, a truth that hints at violence, sabotage, betrayal, or something far more unsettling. After all, when more than 100 people disappear without a trace, the human mind does not drift to gentle endings. It drifts to shadows. The sailors who helped John White search the empty settlement in 1590 certainly felt it. They didn't see an organized departure or a careful migration. They saw something wrong, something missing, something violated. And though they whispered only in private, the sailors had theories. Theories that colonial leaders would later suppress in the name of politics, pride, and the fragile image of empire. Their first suspicion was a brutal one: the Spanish. In the late 1500s, Spain controlled much of the Caribbean, Florida, and the Gulf. English piracy had infuriated the Spanish crown, and England's claim to North America was an insult the Spanish were eager to erase. Spanish records from the era mention secret missions to locate and destroy English outposts before they could gain traction. One Spanish report, discovered centuries later, described a reconnaissance team exploring the coastline, noting English activity, and preparing to eradicate any colonial presence. Another document hinted at a covert attack planned for the island near the shoals, though it didn't specify which one. These discoveries fuel the chilling theory. The colonists didn't leave. They were eliminated.
But if the Spanish had carried out such an operation, where were the signs? Spanish attacks were notoriously brutal, leaving ashes, broken structures, and dead bodies in their wake.
Roanoke had none of that. The settlement was not burned. It was not ransacked. Not a single skeleton testified to violence. Even more suspicious, Spanish records bragged about their victories. They documented each conquered settlement with pride. If they had eradicated Roanoke, they almost certainly would have celebrated it on paper. But they didn't. So scholars dismissed the theory, officially. Yet many quietly acknowledged something odd. The Spanish reports of searching for the colony abruptly stopped in the precise year the colonists vanished. Not because Spain lost interest, but because no further English presence was detected. Germany has a phrase, "Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence." Roanoke fits this perfectly. It is a void in which every possibility remains suspended, including the darkest ones. The next theory, the sailors whispered to White, was even more sinister. Internal betrayal, mutiny, violence from within. The settlers of Roanoke were not an ideal community. Diaries, though few survived, reveal arguments, bitter disputes, and severe shortages of food. Colonial life was not harmonious, it was tense, hungry, desperate. When hunger grows sharp enough, when leadership fails, when the natural world becomes relentless, humans fracture. They turn inward, they turn on each other. Some historians believe factions formed within the colony. One group wanting to move inland, another wanting to sail south, a third wanting to seek protection from native allies. Such divisions could have escalated into violence. Perhaps a leader was killed, sparking chaos. Perhaps a group left and forced others to follow. Perhaps the dismantled houses were an attempt to strip supplies during a hasty evacuation driven not by outside enemies, but by internal collapse. But this theory also suffers from the same flaw as the Spanish one. Where are the bodies? Massacres leave remains. They leave shallow graves, broken bones, burned dwellings. Roanoke had none of that. Even the tools and weapons found later show no signs of combat damage. If violence occurred, it left no scars the earth was willing to reveal.
Then there is the third theory. One early leaders suppressed aggressively because of what it implied. Native retaliation. The region around Roanoke was home to powerful tribes, some of whom had suffered wounds inflicted by English soldiers from earlier expeditions. Disease brought by the English had devastated native populations who had no immunity. Tensions brewed. The settlers depended on local tribes for food, yet often violated agreements, took resources, and misinterpreted cultural norms. Some scholars believe an attack occurred, brief, decisive, complete. The colonists might have been ambushed away from the settlement, leaving the village intact. Their bodies might have been disposed of or placed in ritual sites archaeologists haven't yet found. But here again, the evidence collapses. The tribes of the region kept oral histories, many of which mention the English. None speak of massacring an entire colony. In fact, several tribes recall adopting small groups of starving colonists, not slaughtering them. These oral accounts contradict the idea of a coordinated attack. What lingered instead was a quieter, more disturbing possibility. Perhaps the colonists walked willingly into their doom. A fourth theory, the one that keeps researchers awake at night, suggests the colonists fled into the wilderness believing they were seeking help, but instead encountered an unknown danger, something beyond political conflict, something that left no trace. The Outer Banks and the surrounding forests were, and remain, treacherous. The land shifts constantly. Storms reshape the islands overnight. Sinkholes swallow entire patches of ground. Freshwater sources vanish. Predators lurk unseen. Even sound behaves strangely, bending through fog and trees in disorienting ways. The colonists may have left the settlement in search of food, protection, or better land and simply vanished, lost, scattered, consumed by the maze of waterways and forests. Yet this theory fails for one major reason. Why dismantle the houses? A panicked flight leaves chaos behind, overturned furniture, scattered possessions, half-eaten meals. Roanoke's departure was methodical, calm, almost ritualistic. If danger forced them out, it was not sudden. It was slow, creeping, a pressure that grew gradually until leaving seemed safer than staying. But what danger grows that slow and leaves such little evidence? This brings us to the most controversial theory, the one historians have tiptoed around for decades. Disease, but not the kind that leaves bones, the kind that leaves madness. European diaries from that era describe terrifying outbreaks of neurological illness among settlers, diseases that caused hallucinations, paranoia, violent mood swings, and irrational behavior. Some were caused by spoiled grain contaminated with fungus, the same fungus later linked to the Salem witch trials. Consuming such fungus can cause delirium, memory loss, and a distorted sense of reality.
Imagine an entire colony slowly losing its grasp on reason. People hearing voices in the forest, seeing shapes that weren't there, feeling watched by the trees. Fear spreading like frost through the settlement. Under such conditions, decisions no longer seem rational. The careful dismantling of homes might have seemed necessary. A collective migration might have been driven not by strategy, but by shared delusion. Archaeologists did find evidence that some of the colonists' food supplies had molded, and the region's humid climate made grain spoil quickly. But again, why no bodies? Why no chaos? If sickness drove them away, it should have left signs of misery, scattered belongings, crude graves, attempts at quarantine. But the settlement was eerily tidy, as though arranged for a visitor they knew would come. And then, of course, there is the theory no historian dares publish formally. The colonists were taken. Not by humans, not by disease, by the land. The indigenous peoples of the region told stories of the woods as a living entity, a force that takes those who disrespect it. Europeans scoffed at such stories, yet many settlers described feelings of unease, disorientation, and oppression when traveling through unfamiliar forests. Disappearance in the wild was shockingly common. Even in modern times, people vanish in forests without a trace. No bones, no clothing, no resolution. Roanoke may have been the first recorded case, but not the last. Still, this explanation leaves a bitter taste. It replaces logic with myth, evidence with imagination, and yet sometimes myth survives because it explains what facts cannot. In the end, the darker theories share one thing in common. They demand a sudden, catastrophic event. But Roanoke left no signs of catastrophe. Instead, it left signs of choice. The colonists didn't vanish in panic. They dismantled, they packed, they left messages, they walked away. If violence had come for them, it came silently and patiently. If fear drove them, it was a slow-growing kind. If betrayal occurred, it was hidden well. If the land took them, it swallowed them whole. By the time the sun rose on the morning after John White's storm, Roanoke Island was empty, not because something happened overnight, but because something had been happening for months. A creeping unraveling, a dissolving of community, a final collective decision. And the deeper we dig into the darker theories, the more we realize Roanoke is not a single mystery. It is a cluster of shadows, each casting doubt on the other.
For all the violent, shadow-coded theories that surround Roanoke, there is one possibility that stands apart from the rest. Not because it is less mysterious, but because it is more human. It does not require massacres, mutiny, supernatural intervention, or madness. Instead, it suggests something quieter, almost hopeful, that the colonists did not die at Roanoke at all. They simply left. Not in fear, not in chaos, but in a desperate, deliberate decision to survive. Historians call it the migration hypothesis, but that phrase hardly captures the emotion behind it. Imagine a community starving, watching their crops shrivel under months of unrelenting drought, wells growing brackish, fish disappearing from the shallows, game moving inland, the land itself turning its back on them. Every night the wind carries the same whisper, "You cannot survive here." The colonists were not ignorant. They knew their situation. They had begged John White to go back to England for help. When he finally agreed, they assumed he would return quickly, a few months, maybe half a year. But when a full year passed without news, then 2, then 3, hope did not merely fade, it cracked. Food shortages grew brutal. According to accounts from native tribes, some colonists became gaunt, hollow-eyed, wandering the forest in search of acorns and roots. Others grew irritable, paranoid. Families argued fiercely over scraps. The elderly starved quietly so the young could live. Parents skipped meals, claiming they were not hungry, while their stomachs screamed with pain. At some point, the colonists would have realized what White hadn't yet accepted. No one was coming. And so the whispers of migration began. First in hushed conversations near dying fires, then in broader discussions among families, then in urgent debates about the direction they should take, south toward friendly tribes, inland toward fertile land, or north along the coast where earlier expeditions had found safer harbors. But one option stood above the rest: Croatoan Island. The colonists had allies there, the Croatoan people, led by a chief named Monteo, who had traveled to England twice and been knighted by the English. He was a bridge between worlds, a living symbol of cooperation. The Croatoan tribe had offered help in the past. They knew how to survive the region's brutal climate. They welcomed those who respected their customs.
For a starving colony, Croatoan was not just a location. It was salvation. And so, according to this theory, the colonists decided to leave Roanoke behind before the island consumed them entirely. But this raises a haunting question. Why dismantle the homes? The careful removal of houses has long puzzled historians. It doesn't match panicked escape. It suggests planning. They took what they could carry: beams, planks, tools, nails, transporting precious materials by boat or raft. In a world where every resource mattered, nothing could be wasted. As one archaeologist put it, a home was not a place, it was an investment. Taking the houses apart meant the colonists believed they were rebuilding elsewhere. They did not intend to vanish. They intended to survive. So why leave such a vague message? White had told them explicitly, if danger forced relocation, carve a Maltese cross. If you left willingly, carve the name of your destination. There was no cross, only Croatoan. This is one of the few points of clarity in the entire mystery.
Whatever happened at Roanoke, the colonists left without being attacked. They left with purpose. Their final message is almost painfully reasonable. Yet even within this reason, there are cracks. If they fled to Croatoan for safety, why were there no signs of them when later expeditions searched the island? Why were no English houses, graves, or tools discovered there? Why did the colonists scatter inland towards Site X, leaving English artifacts miles from the coast? Why did indigenous oral histories describe only small groups of colonists, never a group of over 100 people arriving together? Unless, of course, they did not migrate as one. Fear, hunger, leadership disputes, these can splinter a community. The colonists might have broken into factions, each choosing a different path. A group heading to Croatoan, following the alliance promised by Manteo. Another striking inland toward fertile farmland. A third attempting to travel north, chasing rumors of safer English territory. A final desperate few, perhaps trying to survive on the island itself until their bodies yielded to starvation or illness. This fragmented migration fits the archaeological record eerily well. At Site X, the pottery fragments and iron tools could represent only a small portion of the colony, not the full settlement. At Site Y, scattered items on Hatteras Island suggest integration but not mass relocation. Oral traditions mention pale-skinned newcomers living among tribes, sometimes marrying into them, sometimes dying soon after arrival. But nowhere is there evidence of the full colony. If we follow the migration theory to its logical conclusion, Roanoke wasn't one disappearance, it was many. A slow unraveling into the wilderness. A scattering of lives across miles of land. A diaspora born not of violence, but of hunger and despair. Yet this raises another troubling question. Why leave the children? Archaeologists found no traces of toys, cradles, or small belongings at new sites. If families migrated, children would have gone with them. Even if adults split into factions, most families would have stayed together. So where did the children go? Why did no oral history mention so many English children merging with tribal communities? It's possible that many children died before migration, victims of starvation, disease, or exposure. Native tribes had noted a worsening drought, and children are always the first to succumb. If graves were shallow, storms and floods would have erased them entirely. Still, the absence of children in the archaeological record is a shadow too large to ignore. Another question haunts the migration theory. Why didn't they wait? John White had promised to return. Even after 2 years, even after 3, the colonists might have held out hope that reinforcements would eventually arrive. So why not send scouting parties instead of abandoning the entire settlement? Some historians point to a chilling possibility. They didn't leave by choice. They left because they were close to death. A dying settlement cannot wait for rescue. A starving community cannot gamble on faith. Once the colonists realized that John White was not returning in time, and once the drought tightened its grip on the island, waiting was no longer an option. Migration became the only hope of survival. But survival is not guaranteed, and the wilderness does not forgive weakness. Even if they reached Croatoan, even if they were welcomed, they may not have stayed long. Hurricanes, storms, and internal conflicts could have scattered them further. Integration with tribes would dilute their identity within a generation. Children born of mixed families would grow up speaking native languages, adopting native customs.
European artifacts would lose their meaning, becoming mere trinkets exchanged or buried.
Within 2 generations, the English influence would be unrecognizable, and so the colony would vanish, not in a single moment of catastrophe, but in a slow, organic blending into the land. This theory aligns with stories collected generations later, accounts of tribal members with gray or blue eyes, oral traditions describing the people from the sea who were taken in, legends of European wanderers who died far from the coast. But for every story that supports this theory, another fights it. One of the most perplexing archaeological findings at Hatteras Island was a hilt of a European sword, a sign of English presence, found far from any known settlement. But the blade itself was missing. Only the hilt remained, a symbolic object, stripped of its weaponry, buried like a relic. Why? Some believe this was ceremonial, a burial of identity, a symbolic surrender of Englishness in exchange for survival. Others believe it was simply discarded. Still others believe it represents a darker story, one in which the sword was broken during conflict, not peace. The migration theory holds possibility, hope, and tragedy in equal measure. It paints a picture of a colony that fought to survive, not one that was destroyed. It suggests a future for the colonists, a future lived in new communities, new families, new identities. But it also suggests something else, something more subtle. Perhaps Roanoke didn't vanish. Perhaps it endured, just not as Roanoke. Perhaps the colony exists today, not in records or ruins, but in bloodlines, in forgotten graves, in artifacts scattered across centuries. Perhaps the only real disappearance was the disappearance of English identity, as the colonists adapted to the land that once resisted them. But this theory, for all its humanity, still cannot answer the one question that shadows every explanation. Why? If they survived, why no clear trace? Why no letters, no later sightings, no English descendants claiming Roanoke ancestry? Why no return visits to the abandoned site? Why no attempt to communicate with England again? Migration offers explanation, but not closure. And humanity, for all its complexity, rarely disappears without a footprint. Roanoke is the most famous disappearance in early colonial history, but it is far from the only one. In fact, when we widen our view beyond the small island off the Carolina coast, we begin to see something unsettling. Roanoke was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern, a repeating echo across continents, oceans, and centuries. Communities that seemed strong one year, fragile the next, and then gone the moment anyone turned their eyes away. The deeper you dive into history, the clearer it becomes that entire settlements vanish far more frequently than we'd like to admit. It is not a footnote. It is a recurring phenomenon, a shadow that trails humanity. Roanoke was simply the first American whisper of a much older, larger story. And once you hear it, you realize it's been happening everywhere. Long before the English carved their hopes into Roanoke's soil, the Norse had carved theirs into the frozen shores of Greenland. These Viking settlers arrived around the year 985, building farms, churches, and villages sturdy enough to withstand brutal winters. They thrived for centuries, long enough to build a cathedral, raise livestock, and trade with Europe. But then, gradually, things changed. The climate cooled. Trade ships stopped coming. Soil that once produced barley now froze. Walrus ivory, their main export, lost value in Europe. Year by year, the colony weakened, and then, sometime in the 1400s, it simply vanished. When later expeditions finally reached the abandoned settlements, they found something eerily familiar. Houses still standing, tools sitting neatly on shelves. No signs of war or fire, no bodies. Just quiet. Just absence. Historians suggest several possibilities: famine, disease, conflict with the Inuit, but none fully explain why a thriving community disintegrated without leaving graves, letters, or final records. It resembles Roanoke so closely that some scholars refer to it as the Northern Mirror. A slow unraveling, a silent dispersal, a community swallowed, not struck down.
Centuries later, a small French settlement near what is now Detroit would experience a similar disappearance, though on a smaller scale. Early maps reference it, journals mention it, but its physical remains are almost non-existent, as though the settlement had been erased rather than abandoned. According to local stories, the colonists at Nain Rouge struggled with harsh winters and mysterious attacks on their livestock. Then one spring, a supply ship arrived to find the settlement deserted. Food still hanging over fires, boats still tied at the shore, footprints leading into the forest, and never returning. Native tribes in the region spoke of a red spirit, the little man of the woods, who was seen before tragedy struck. The French settlers called him the Nain Rouge, the Red Dwarf, a trickster or omen. While historians dismiss the supernatural explanation, the facts remain. A functioning settlement disappeared without bodies or battle. Like Roanoke, the absence is the most haunting detail. Even in the far North Atlantic, where communities cling to volcanic rock and live by the dictum of survival, vanishings have occurred that defy explanation. On the eastern coast of Iceland, a fishing village from the early 17th century was found completely deserted. Nets lay drying on racks, boats bobbed peacefully in the water. A half-prepared meal was still warm in a pot beside the hearth. But no people. Search parties scoured the coastline for days, but not a single body washed ashore. Not a single footprint suggested where the villagers had gone. The sea, the land, and the wind gave nothing. Just like Roanoke. Just like Greenland. Just like so many others quietly recorded in European diaries, but rarely studied. All of them share the same haunting characteristics: a functioning settlement, sudden departure, no signs of violence, no remains, no explanation, as if whole communities stepped out of reality. When researchers place these cases side by side, strange similarities emerge. 1. Isolation. Each settlement was physically cut off by oceans, forests, ice, or vast distances. These were communities vulnerable to both nature and the unknown. Climate stress. Drought at Roanoke, cooling at Greenland, harsh winters in Michigan, unpredictable weather in Iceland. Nature often served as a slow noose. Gradual breakdown. Food shortages, trade failures, resource scarcity, internal fracturing.
Communities rarely vanish instantly. They weaken first. They thin. They scatter. 4. Silence. The final common denominator. Not one of these settlements left farewell messages, letters, journals, or detailed accounts. Their last days are blank pages. Their final decisions are unrecorded. It is as though each community passed into wordless oblivion. Human beings do not vanish peacefully. They leave signs, they leave graves, they leave stories. So why do these settlements leave nothing? One unsettling theory suggests that the disappearance of a community often occurs in its weakest moment, when fear grows not from a single threat,
but from the slow pressure of many. Starvation, illness, enemy tribes, storms, and internal conflict can combine into a single, crushing weight. When fear builds gradually, not suddenly, people do strange things. They change plans abruptly. They abandon identity. They splinter into factions. They walk away from homes. They vanish in waves, not all at once. By the time the main settlement is found empty, the first splinters may have already died or dissolved into other cultures. This theory transforms disappearances from sudden mysteries into the final stage of long collapses. And yet, there is still something uncanny about how consistently these vanishings leave no bodies. It is one thing for a few families to die in the wilderness. It is another for whole communities to vanish without leaving remains. Bones survive everything. But in these cases, the earth has swallowed them whole.
Across Africa, Asia, and South America, similar cases appear in the historical record. A mining town in the Andes, abandoned with tools still in hand. A desert community in North Africa, found with bread left baking in ovens. A Himalayan village where every house was empty, doors wide open, animals still alive, but not a single villager remained. In each case, theories abound. Disease, migration, raiders, environmental collapse. Yet the silence that follows, the total absence of remains, echoes Roanoke again and again. It is as though the world occasionally performs a kind of reset, clearing human presence from a place with surgical precision. If disappearances are so common, why does Roanoke haunt us? Because unlike Viking Greenland or the Icelandic fishermen, Roanoke was young, fragile, filled with families, women, and children on the brink of building a new identity. It was a cultural seed that never sprouted, a promise that died before it could breathe properly. And more importantly, Roanoke left behind a message. Croatoan. A word so small, so cryptic, so loaded with meaning that historians have spent centuries trying to decode it. None of the other vanished settlements left such a breadcrumb. Most left nothing at all. Roanoke left a single word. A word that suggests intention. A word that suggests destination. A word that suggests the colonists were not taken, they walked. This is what makes Roanoke uniquely haunting. It is a disappearance with a direction. But even that direction dissolves into mist because Croatoan Island offered no answers either. It had no English homes, no graves, no letters, no signs of mass migration. Roanoke's trail, like all the others, stops abruptly. And in that stop, that silence, we hear a pattern echo. Human settlements disappear not with a scream, but with a whisper.
The most unsettling interpretation is not that Roanoke was unique, but that it was normal. Communities vanish. People leave their lives behind. Nature absorbs their traces. Time finishes the job. But this explanation does not comfort. It disturbs, because it implies a truth we do not want to face. Human presence is fragile. No matter how strong a community feels, how hopeful, how determined, it can be erased almost instantly by a combination of forces. Hunger, fear, isolation, weather, conflict, and the silent cruelty of the wilderness. Every vanished settlement across history whispers the same message. Nothing is permanent. Not families, not villages, not dreams, not even civilizations. Roanoke is not a single wound. It is part of a deep scar that crosses human history. There are mysteries that whisper, like fading legends. And then there are mysteries that scream without ever making a sound. Moments when time itself seems to stop, when a place looks as though its people have merely stepped outside for a breath of air, but they never return. Among all the vanished settlements that echo Roanoke's fate, none is more unsettling than the disappearance at Angikuni Lake. It is a story that has drifted between truth and folklore, between official reports and campfire fear, for nearly a century. Some call it myth, others insist it is one of the most disturbing disappearances ever recorded. What makes this case so haunting is not just the absence of people, but the presence of everything else: meals, tools, weapons, clothing, left behind as if frozen in time. If Roanoke vanished gradually, dissolving over months or years, the Angikuni Lake settlement vanished in an instant. And that instant has never been explained.
It was November of 1930. The Canadian winter had begun its slow, merciless takeover of the northern wilderness. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, blanketing the landscape in silence. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the world like a lid. A trapper named Joe LaBelle, a man seasoned by years of harsh winters, trudged through the frigid air toward an Inuit village he had visited many times before. The settlement was small, fewer than a dozen families, but always vibrant, always full of life, smoke curling from igloos, voices echoing across the frozen lake. On this day, however, something was wrong. No smoke, no movement, no barking dogs. Only the wind. As LaBelle approached the village, he felt that instinctive tightening in the chest. The same tightening John White must have felt centuries earlier on the shores of Roanoke. Something was off. The air felt too still, too expectant. He stepped into the first igloo. Inside, a pot hung over the fire pit, stew still in it, partially cooked, as if someone had been tending it minutes earlier. But the fire was dead, cold to the touch. Nearby, handmade tools lay neatly arranged. Furs were spread out for sleeping. A child's toy carved from bone lay in a corner. Everything was exactly where it should be, except the people. LaBelle checked another igloo, then another. Each one told the same story. Meals prepared, clothing left behind, weapons untouched. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. The snow was too fresh, too clean. It was as though the villagers had evaporated. What unnerved LaBelle most was the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of interruption. The kind that happens when life is suddenly cut short. A pair of mittens lay near a doorway, as if a child had been about to put them on. A fishing spear rested against a wall, perfectly positioned for a morning trip to the ice. Human life had been paused mid-action, frozen, not by the weather, but by something else. LaBelle fled the village, his mind racing. When he reached the nearest telegraph station, he relayed what he had seen. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigated. Their report, though later disputed and muddied by bureaucratic detachment, echoed the hunter's story in its chilling essence. The village was empty. Utterly empty. And what they found next only deepens the nightmare. Sled dogs were the lifeblood of Arctic communities. Companions, protectors, transportation. These dogs were hardy, loyal, nearly impossible to kill. Yet near the settlement, police found them tied to stakes, starved to death. What made this discovery even stranger was the timing. A dog can survive without food for weeks, but these dogs had not been fed for long enough to die slowly, painfully. This meant the villagers were gone long enough for their animals to die in confinement. Yet the stew in the igloo had only recently frozen. 2 timelines. 2 contradictory clues. 1 impossible mystery. How could the food be fresh while the dogs were long dead? According to early accounts, one of the burial mounds near the settlement appeared disturbed, not by animals, but deliberately dug up. Modern skeptics argue this part of the story was exaggerated or misreported. But even if the detail is uncertain, the suggestion alone bleeds darkness into the narrative. If someone, or something, dug up the grave, was it in search of something or someone? And if the grave disturbance was not real, if it was merely rumor, then the mystery becomes even more suffocatingly mundane. A silent village, untouched, unviolated, simply empty. Empty like Roanoke, empty like Greenland, empty like the Icelandic fishing town. Human life erased with surgical precision.
Skeptics have tried to rationalize the Angikuni disappearance for decades. They offer theories, each more fragile than the last. 1. The villagers migrated. Perhaps starvation forced them to leave quickly. But if that were true, why leave food? Why abandon weapons? Why not free the dogs? Why leave clothing needed for survival? Why leave everything? Humans facing starvation cling to life. They do not walk into the wilderness unarmed. This explanation collapses under its own weight. 2. They were attacked. By who? Or what? There were no signs of struggle. No blood, no footprints, no broken items, no missing possessions. An attack violent enough to remove dozens of people does not leave a village pristine. 3. It never happened. Some argue the story is a myth, but police documents, written accounts, and multiple witness testimonies disagree. Even if part of the story was exaggerated, the core fact remains. A functioning settlement was abandoned with no explanation. The same signature as Roanoke. Then there are the explanations that sit at the edges of belief. Theories built not from logic, but from fear. The Inuit have stories older than the first map makers. Stories of beings who move silently through the blizzard, who take those who wander too far from the warmth of human fire. They are not creatures in the Western sense. They are forces, hunger, cold, the personification of the wilderness itself. Some tribes fear the Tongarusk, a spirit said to lure people into the snow, never to return. Did the villagers see something in the night? Hear something? Follow something?
Such stories are difficult for rational minds to accept. But in the far north, where survival is a constant negotiation with nature, it is easy to understand why people would believe the land itself could swallow them. Just as the Algonquin once warned that the woods near Roanoke held spirits older than memory. Different continents, different cultures, same fear. A fear of the wilderness watching back. The parallels between Angikuni Lake and Roanoke are too striking to ignore. 1. Abandoned settlement. Roanoke's houses were dismantled. Angikuni's igloos sat untouched.
but in both, no people. 2. Meals left behind. Roanoke's fire pits were empty but clean. Angikuni's meal was half-cooked. In both, a sudden interruption. 3. No bodies. No graves, no bones, no remains. 4. Tools intact. No robbery, no plunder, no signs of conflict. 5. Total silence. No letters, no footprints, no witnesses. It is as if these settlements were removed, not destroyed, not fled, but cleanly extracted from existence. A surgical disappearance.
Why do both Roanoke and Angikuni defy logic in exactly the same ways? Historians propose two broad explanations. 1. Human instinct in collapse. When a community faces a slow, suffocating threat, starvation, storms, loss of leadership, the collapse becomes psychological, not physical. People make irrational choices. They split into small groups. They wander. They die in hidden places. Their bodies disappear into the landscape. In this interpretation, Roanoke and Angikuni reflect the way human societies crumble under pressure, not with violence, but with dispersal. This is the comforting explanation. The second explanation is harder to articulate. It suggests that some places exert an influence, not magical, not supernatural, but environmental and psychological, that crushes human cohesion. Loneliness, isolation, deep winter, fear of the forest, fear of the sea, fear of the unknown. When these forces converge, communities fracture in ways that defy prediction. But this explanation, too, has holes. Because even when groups fracture, they leave bodies, they leave trails, they leave something. Roanoke and Angikuni left nothing, a nothingness too complete to be natural. Let us imagine, for a moment, that last night. A fire burning low, snow beginning to fall, families eating their evening meal, dogs resting in a circle around the igloos. And then, something changes. A sound in the distance, a light, a voice, a feeling. Fear, sudden and collective, but not panic. The people rise.
Not screaming, not running, walking. Into the snow, into the night, into silence. No struggle, no violence. Just departure. An abandonment so deliberate it feels like ritual. A scene eerily reminiscent of the dismantled homes at Roanoke. An orderliness that does not match desperation. What follows is nothing. No footprints, no bodies, no answers. Just emptiness where life once lived. When communities disappear once, it is tragedy. When they disappear twice, it is coincidence. But when they disappear again and again in eerily similar ways, it becomes a pattern that historians try to rationalize, a pattern that archaeologists try to dig through, a pattern that the earth itself refuses to explain. Roanoke was not the first. Angikuni was not the last. Humanity is dotted with vanished settlements like scars. Every time, the story is the same. A community breathes, then stops. Not violently, not loudly, silently. As if life slips away when no one is looking.
Deep in the uncharted jungles of South America lies one of history's most intoxicating mirages, a city of gold whispered through centuries of rumor, desire, and disappearance. The Spanish called it El Dorado, but the indigenous tribes had another name for one of its legendary manifestations, Paititi. If Roanoke vanished under the shadow of drought and Angikuni Lake under the shroud of winter, then Paititi swallowed its followers under a canopy so thick that sunlight itself struggled to reach the forest floor. Those who entered the jungle in search of the Golden City didn't just die, they disappeared,
consumed by a wilderness that breathed like a living force. In this chapter, we step into the green jaws of the Amazon, where entire colonial expeditions vanished as completely as Roanoke settlers, but within a landscape far more merciless, ancient, and impenetrable. The legend of Paititi began long before Europeans set foot in the New World. According to the tales of the Quechua and other Andean peoples, there existed a hidden city in the eastern rainforests, a last stronghold of the Inca, a sanctuary of wealth and sacred objects carried away during the Spanish conquest. It was said that the Inca, foreseeing their empire's fall, retreated deep into the jungle, taking with them gold idols, sacred mummies, ceremonial jewelry, unfinished treasures, and knowledge meant only for divine ears. To the Inca, Paititi was not a place of greed, it was a holy refuge. But to the Spanish, it became an obsession. The jungles whispered promises of gold that could break empires or build them anew, and so the colonists marched into the rainforest blind to the truth. The jungle doesn't welcome intruders, it consumes them. Like Roanoke, Paititi is less a place and more a shadow across the map, a void where people go and never return. In the late 1500s, around the same era Roanoke was collapsing, the first major Spanish expedition in search of Paititi set off from Cusco. More than 200 men followed their commander into the endless green. They carried weapons, horses, priests, translators, and dreams of gold. Some brought mirrors and beads to trade, others carried cannons. The jungle swallowed the sound of their drums as they marched. Weeks passed, then months. The trail they cut behind them faded almost instantly, overtaken by vines and shifting undergrowth. The deeper they traveled, the more the rainforest distorted reality. Vines that looked like snakes, shadows that moved, calls from unseen animals echoing like human voices. The expedition's last recorded sighting came from an indigenous scout who fled shortly before the group disappeared. He told villagers the Spaniards had grown paranoid, exhausted, plagued by insects and heat, and by something else, something in the forest that watched them at night. He said their boots sank into mud that felt warm like flesh. He said the trees seemed to lean closer each day. He said the forest whispered. Then he left them. When rescue parties attempted to follow weeks later, they found nothing. No bodies, no weapons, no horses, no armor, not even rust. In a rainforest that eats metal, bones, and fabric quickly, disappearance is easy, but total disappearance? No trace at all? That is something else entirely. A few decades later, around the early 1600s, another group, this time a mix of Spaniards and desperate colonists seeking fortune, attempted to build a temporary settlement on the edge of the Andes as a base camp for their quest for Paititi. They constructed wooden huts, carved pathways into the jungle, and began preparing for the journey east. But the deeper they searched for Paititi, the more supplies disappeared. Food would vanish from storage huts, tools would go missing, fires would extinguish in the night. Footprints appeared that did not belong to the colonists. Rumors spread. Someone was watching them. Something was shadowing their movements. Some nights they heard drums in the distance. Other nights, laughter. And on one terrifying night, screaming. At dawn, they found one of their men gone. No blood, no footprints, just an empty sleeping mat. They could no longer tell whether it was the jungle or the people within it who threatened them. Then one morning, the entire colony was simply empty. Nearby tribes later claimed they found the settlement abandoned, fires still smoldering, tools arranged neatly, clothes hung to dry on lines, but no humans. Sound familiar? Like Roanoke, the huts were intact. Like Angikuni, meals were partially prepared. And like Greenland,
no remains were ever found. It was as if the colony had walked into the trees in unison.
Modern explorers and anthropologists who study the disappearance of Paititi expeditions often point to the Amazon's well-known ability to erase evidence. Humidity rots clothing within weeks. Soil acidity dissolves bone. Insects strip bodies clean. Plants grow over any trace in days. But this natural decay does not explain the strangest pattern: total loss of human remains. Even if expedition members were scattered by disease or predators, some artifacts, helmets, swords, metal buckles, should have remained. Yet the jungle yielded nothing. No rusted steel, no skeletons, no evidence of camps. Just like Roanoke's missing graves. Just like Angikuni's missing footprints. Just like Iceland's missing fishermen. The wilderness holds its secrets with a terrifying grip. Tribes who lived near the rumored region of Paititi told the Spaniards repeatedly, "Do not go east. The forest will swallow you. The spirits do not want you there." The Spanish, believing in steel and God, ignored these warnings. But the tribal stories were more complex than simple superstition. Some spoke of protectors guarding sacred land. Others spoke of invisible hunters who lived between the trees. And some claimed the forest itself was alive, moving, shifting, consuming. To the tribes, those who sought Paititi were not explorers. They were intruders. So when entire expeditions disappeared, the tribes felt no surprise. They simply stated they were taken. Not killed, not hunted, taken. By whom? By what? No one ever said. Because some things are not spoken aloud.
Documents from the era hint at another possibility: a collapse from within, driven by hunger, illness, and madness. The deeper the expeditions went, the more fragmented they became. Some men reportedly abandoned their commanders, choosing instead to live with tribes who offered food and safety. Others turned violent, desperate, hallucinating from dehydration or consuming toxic plants. In the green labyrinth, reality bends easily. A man can walk away from a campfire and vanish in 20 steps. If the colonies splintered, some turning back, some pressing forward, some joining tribes, the disappearance would appear total to those searching. But again, this does not explain the lack of bodies or belongings. Human fragmentation leaves breadcrumbs. Paititi seekers left none. Unless those who survived didn't want to be found. Unless survival meant disappearing on purpose. Unless assimilation required secrecy. Perhaps the colonists who reached the jungle tribes dissolved into their community so completely that they ceased to be Spanish. Not dead, not vanished, transformed. In the early 20th century, a famed explorer named Percy Fawcett went searching for a lost Amazonian city. Some believe it was Paititi or a related legend. He, too, vanished. Modern rescue teams found nothing. Not a shred of fabric, not a bone, not a button. The forest swallowed him, the way it had swallowed entire villages before. History forgets the names of most who sought Paititi, because none returned with stories. Only absence, only silence. But in that silence lies the same pattern we've been tracing since Roanoke. A community sets out in hope. It builds structures. It plans a future. And then, piece by piece, it goes missing. No massacre, no disaster, no final message. Just the forest closing in, just the rain washing the trail, just the green darkness absorbing human footprints.
just as the Atlantic storms erased Roanoke's last steps, just as the Arctic snow erased Angikuni's, just as time erased the Viking colonies.
In the villages surrounding the rumored location of Paititi, elders still pass down a warning. The jungle does not kill loudly. It kills with silence. That silence, the same silence that greeted John White, the same silence that filled the igloos of Angikuni, is the most terrifying sound in history. It is the silence of removal, not destruction. A silence of absorption, not violence. A silence that suggests the world is watching, waiting, choosing. Perhaps Paititi was never meant to be found. Perhaps those who sought it were never meant to return. Perhaps the jungle simply does what the sea, the mountains, and the ice also do. It reclaims. And sometimes it keeps. When people talk about the disappearance of entire settlements, they often look outward to enemies, storms, or supernatural forces. But sometimes the greatest threat lies not outside the walls of a community, but inside the human mind, where hunger sharpens its claws, fear curls into something feral, and survival warps into violence. There is a point in every collapsing settlement when logic fractures, when the world narrows, when the rules that once defined civilization fall away like rotten wood. Roanoke, Greenland, Angikuni, Paititi, each disappearance shares signs of slow starvation, psychological unraveling, and quiet collapse. But to understand the most intimate, most disturbing layer of these vanishings, we need to examine the darkest human response to desperation. Cannibalism, famine, madness. Not because it is sensational, but because history has witnessed it again and again. When humans are pushed far enough, the unimaginable becomes inevitable. Long before the final disappearance, the signs of collapse begin subtly. It starts with hunger. Not the kind that pangs before dinner, the kind that hollows the stomach like a pit, gnawing from the inside out. The kind that steals sleep, shakes hands, and shrinks the world into a tunnel. In the final months at Roanoke, tree ring data confirms the worst drought in centuries. Crops withered, fish grew scarce, even the indigenous tribes struggled to feed their own people. Hunger gnaws at reason. Hunger destroys community bonds. Hunger turns parents against their own future.
And there is a point, a razor-thin line, where hunger becomes desperation, and desperation becomes madness. Anthropologists call it the starvation threshold, when the brain begins shutting down functions that define humanity: empathy, patience, judgment, morality. Civilization crumbles not in riots, but in whispers. Arguments begin. Suspicion brews. Groups fracture. Leadership fails. Fear grows teeth. And fear, unlike hunger, does not simply kill, it transforms. To understand how starvation breaks communities, we look to one of the most well-documented cases in American history, the Donner Party. A group of pioneers trapped in the Sierra Nevada snow. Families, children, friends. Their descent into cannibalism did not begin with savagery. It began with silence. One family died quietly. Another followed. People vanished into the blizzard searching for food, leaving behind only empty bedrolls. The survivors convinced themselves they had no choice. They cooked the flesh of their neighbors, cried as they ate, then cried when they didn't, because starvation is a slow death, and moral lines do not survive starvation. The madness that followed fractured the group. Some wandered into the storm muttering incoherently.
Some turned violent. Some refused to sleep for fear of being eaten next. By the time rescue arrived, the dead far outnumbered the living. What happened to the Donner Party is not unique. It is simply documented. Now, imagine dozens of smaller, undocumented collapses across the wilderness of early North America. Imagine Roanoke during its final year. Imagine food supplies dwindling. Imagine children crying through the night. Imagine arguments turning violent. Imagine the moment when people stopped imagining and started acting.
Cannibalism was not unheard of in early colonies. It was not even uncommon. Jamestown, one of the earliest English settlements, provides chilling evidence. During the starving time of 1609 to 1610, colonists ate rats, ate shoe leather boiled into broth, dug up corpses, and butchered the body of a teenage girl. Archaeologists confirmed the girl's bones had intentional cut marks, not from murder, from desperation. If Jamestown, with its fresh water, fertile soil, and far more resources fell into cannibalism, then Roanoke, suffering worse drought and greater isolation, likely skirted the same threshold. Cannibalism doesn't erase people, but it fractures communities. It sparks violence, panic, and psychological collapse. It leads groups to scatter, abandoning the settlement to flee from unspeakable acts they participated in or escaped from. Imagine a group of colonists turning on each other. Not all, not most, just a small, desperate faction. The others flee, take their children, dismantle their homes, leave a message. Not because they fear the wilderness, but because they fear their own neighbors. This is a theory some historians whisper privately, because it is too dark, too close to the bone of human nature, too revealing of our fragility. And yet, it fits. No bodies found, no graves, no signs of battle. Why? Because if colonists killed colonists, the survivors would remove the evidence, fearful of being accused if rescue arrived. Terrified of their own guilt, terrified of judgment, terrified of each other.
Starvation is only half the story. Isolation is the other. Roanoke Island was psychologically suffocating. The colonists were surrounded by dense forest, unpredictable tides, and tribes who alternated between cautious allies and wary enemies. They were encircled by the unknown. Isolation breeds suspicion. People begin to imagine threats where none exist. They hear voices in the wind. They interpret animal cries as warnings. They see shadows as figures watching them from the trees. Sleep deprivation amplifies fear. Fear amplifies division. Division amplifies collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests the colonists built defensive structures not toward the sea, where pirates or Spaniards might have attacked, but toward the forest, meaning their fear came from inland. They feared what moved among the trees, or what they believed moved among them. This fear could have driven them into two directions: into the forest to seek safety among native tribes, away from the forest to seek safety inland. A fracture, a split, a community pulled apart by fear. Even without cannibalism, madness can dissolve settlements. Fear can scatter people so thoroughly that none ever reunite. Imagine Roanoke during its last month. Food nearly gone, people weak, trembling, hollow-eyed, the forest closing in, shadows moving at the edge of torchlight, arguments erupting, accusations flying. A child goes missing. No one knows where. Some search the woods. Others insist someone inside the settlement is responsible. Trust collapses. Small groups break away. Some flee to Croatoan Island, others trek inland, others head north, others simply disappear. The abandoned village could be the result of not one disappearance, but many. A family leaves one night. A week later, another vanishes. A month later, half the settlement begins preparing to flee. The last remaining group dismantles the houses, taking supplies with them. By the time John White returned, the settlement had experienced a slow-motion unraveling. Not a single moment of catastrophe, 1,000 small fractures. Starvation, fear, isolation, violence, madness. A colony dying in pieces.
People often imagine cannibalism leaves dramatic evidence, but in starvation collapses, it is the opposite. In Jamestown, bones were found only because archaeologists were extraordinarily lucky. Soft tissues decay quickly. Shallow graves disappear in storms. Tools used for butchering can be simple knives, indistinguishable from normal cooking implements. If cannibalism occurred at Roanoke, bones could have been burned, bodies buried shallowly and washed away by storms, evidence scattered during migrations, remains consumed entirely, tools repurposed or removed by later groups. In a fragile colony, erasing traces of cannibalism could have been an act of pure survival, not out of shame, but fear that future rescuers would condemn them. The colonists may have hidden their darkest moments, taking the truth with them into the forest. People imagine madness as screaming, violence, and chaos, but starvation madness is quieter. It looks like whispering to yourself, staring into nothing, walking into the woods without explanation, believing you're being watched, seeing shapes that aren't there, becoming convinced you must leave, convincing others to follow, abandoning shelter for the illusion of safety. When John White returned to Roanoke, he didn't find signs of chaos. He found signs of orderly abandonment. Because starvation madness is methodical. People cling to routines even as their minds fray. They dismantle houses. They pack supplies. They carve messages. They try to maintain the illusion of control even as they slip away. Some might have believed they were saving themselves. Others might have believed they were fleeing something real. But all of them, whatever their reasons, left Roanoke behind as though it had become uninhabitable not just physically, but mentally. A place haunted not by ghosts, but by human suffering.
We like to imagine ourselves as resilient, unbreakable, rational beings. But history shows the opposite. Communities collapse not because of one catastrophic blow, but because of 100 small ones. Roanoke did not need monsters. It had hunger. It had fear. It had isolation. And those forces are enough to make humans do things they would never admit, even to themselves. The colonists may not have vanished mysteriously. They may have fled their own minds. And that is a disappearance far more terrifying. Long before the English carved their village into the wild soil of Roanoke Island, the land belonged to legends far older than European memory. The forests whispered with stories, the ocean carried warnings in its tides, and the sky itself was said to darken not for weather, but for the passing of spirits. To the colonists, these stories were strange, frightening, and often dismissed, until desperation hollowed their hearts and made them listen. Fear has a way of sharpening the imagination, of turning shadows into figures, of turning sounds into threats, of turning stories into reality. Tonight we step into the legends that shaped the world around Roanoke, and the disappearances that followed. Because sometimes the mind collapses not under starvation alone, but under the stories people believe about the night. And in the dark forests of North America, the night was alive. When the English arrived in the late 16th century, they stepped into a world that had been shaped for thousands of years by indigenous traditions, traditions that understood the land in ways the colonists could not grasp. To the Algonquian-speaking tribes of the region, the world was not empty wilderness, it was inhabited, profoundly, constantly, by forces that existed in the margins between life and death, safety and danger, human and non-human. The English saw trees and dirt. The indigenous tribes saw spirits. And when the colonists arrived, tired, hungry, and trembling from the journey, the land felt indifferent to them, or worse, watchful. As relationships with native tribes deteriorated, the colonists began hearing whispered stories they were never meant to hear, stories spoken around fires the English were not invited to sit beside, stories of beings that moved through the forests without leaving footprints, stories of disappearances, stories that began to bleed into the colonists' fragile minds.
One of the most widespread legends among the tribes near Roanoke was the belief that the forests were alive with watchers, beings neither human nor animal, who appeared only when the balance of nature was disturbed. They were described in different ways. Some tribes spoke of tall, thin figures with faces like bark and limbs like branches. Others described pale shapes, moving silently between the trees. Some said they were spirits of ancestors guarding sacred land. Others called them messengers of the wilderness itself. They were not inherently evil. They were guardians, observers, presences. But they punished disrespect, and they despised those who took more from the land than they gave. The colonists, desperate and fearful, cut trees, hunted animals, dug into the soil, and disrupted the rhythms of the island. They did not understand the rituals required to seek the land's permission. To the watchers, they were intruders. When crops failed and wells dried, some colonists whispered that the watchers were angry. They spoke of seeing shapes in the trees at night, of eyes reflecting torchlight where no animal stood, of feeling followed on hunting trips. One diary entry, later found in England, written by a Roanoke settler who returned early, mentioned shadows that walk. It described the forest as too quiet, and claimed the woods whisper at us when the wind is still. Such words are easy to dismiss as paranoia, but starvation dulls logic, fear sharpens imagination, and the forest at night can make anyone believe in watchers. Far from Roanoke, in the tribes of the American Southwest, existed tales of skinwalkers, shapeshifters, witches, beings who could mimic humans or animals and lure people away from safety. Although this legend did not originate in the Carolinas, stories of shape-shifting spirits traveled far, through indigenous trade routes, carried and reshaped like drifting seeds. Some versions reached the East Coast. Those stories reached Roanoke. The colonists may not have known the word skinwalker, but they knew the fear of it. They spoke of animals behaving strangely, wolves approaching too close without fear, birds that perched and stared as though they understood, footsteps in the woods that changed rhythm, sometimes light, sometimes heavy. Some settlers claimed they saw distant torches flickering between the trees, but when they approached, there were no paths, no footprints. And once, when a hunting party failed to return, members of the colony whispered that the woods had taken their shapes. A terrifying idea, that the forest did not kill, it imitated.
Whether the colonists believed these stories literally or simply feared the people who carried them, the effect was the same. Every rustle became a warning, every shadow a threat, every unexplained disappearance a sign that something supernatural lingered nearby. Panic grows in silence, and silence was all Roanoke had left. The Outer Banks, the thin stretch of islands near Roanoke, were feared by sailors long before the English arrived. Storms rose without warning. Waves devoured ships. Sandbars shifted, trapping vessels and drowning entire crews. Indigenous tribes spoke of sea spirits, creatures said to drag the living into the depths. Not mermaids, not monsters, but beings made of water and storm. To them, the ocean was not an enemy. It was a god, and gods demand respect. Colonists reported strange lights over the water, voices carried by the wind at night, phantom ships seen in the fog, waves that crashed without wind, whirlpools that formed suddenly in shallow waters. During Roanoke's drought, the sea levels fluctuated unnaturally. The colonists had no explanation. The tribes did. They said the sea spirits were restless. When the colonists began disappearing in small groups, week by week, some believed the sea spirits were claiming them, punishing the English for landing on shores not meant for them. The English did not know how to read the sea, but the sea knew how to read them.
Almost every indigenous culture has a version of a forest spirit that lures the unwary into the woods. Some mimic voices, some mimic loved ones, some appear as lights between the trees, some appear as people who disappeared long ago. The English had no frame of reference for these beings, but they recognized fear when they saw it. One tribal elder warned the colonists that the forest had taken men for generations, and that those who heard singing in the night should never follow it. Strangely, colonists later reported hearing singing, thin, distant, lilting tones drifting through the pine trees. No source, no explanation. Some believed it was a tribe preparing a ritual. Others believed it was a threat. But one diary fragment, the handwriting hurried, uneven, contained only one chilling sentence. The children hear it most. Children are always the first to see what adults deny, the first to sense what adults cannot rationalize. If the children spoke of shapes in the woods, the adults would have found comfort in interpreting those shapes as imagination, until imagination bled into fear, and fear bled into migration. As the colonists' conditions worsened, the supernatural fears took on a life of their own. It became impossible to separate truth from panic. One colonist might have seen shadows in the woods that were simply shadows, yet whispered stories turned those shadows into spirits. A group of colonists hearing wolves howl might have mistaken the sound for voices because they expected voices. Someone losing their way in the dark forest might have believed they were being led astray because the stories said so. The mind bends reality when it is starving, lonely, exhausted, and afraid. Supernatural legends did not have to be real. They only had to be believed. And once believed, they shaped decisions that left Roanoke's settlement dismantled and deserted. Imagine the final days. Children crying from hunger and fear. Adults arguing over whether the island was cursed. Hunting parties not returning. Strange sounds in the woods. Strange lights in the distance. Whispers of spirits watching from the trees. the belief that salvation lay at Croatoan, the belief that staying meant death, not from starvation, but from something older. Fear does not need a face, only a direction. And fear pointed away from Roanoke.
Modern historians may dismiss supernatural legends as irrelevant, but they miss the real point. It doesn't matter if the legends were real. It matters that the colonists believed they were. Belief shapes behavior. Behavior shapes fate. If enough colonists believed the island was cursed, that the forest contained something watching them, then leaving wasn't just logical, it was necessary. Even dismantling the houses could have been ritualistic, an attempt to remove their presence from cursed ground, to avoid leaving spirits anything to cling to. Even the carved word Croatoan might have been less a clue and more a protection, a way to associate themselves with a friendly tribe known to have spiritual authority. Fear does not vanish. It migrates, and Roanoke may have migrated with it. To indigenous tribes, Roanoke's disappearance was not surprising. It fit their worldview. People vanish when they disrespect the land. People vanish when they wander into the domain of spirits. People vanish when they break harmony with the world around them. The English did not understand this harmony. Their fear consumed them. Their disappearance was not the work of monsters. It was the work of belief combined with desperation. Supernatural folklore did not erase them. It guided them toward their final decision. Roanoke did not die from starvation alone. It died from stories. Stories older than the colonists. Stories they thought they could ignore. Stories that watched them from the trees. And when the last of them walked into the forest, following a voice, real or imagined, the land took them in. Not violently, not suddenly, silently. Exactly as the legends said it would.
When we strip away the mystery, remove the legends, push aside the supernatural whispers, and silence the storms that swallowed entire settlements, one truth remains. Stark and unavoidable. Human communities are far more fragile than we like to believe. Roanoke did not need monsters. It did not need demon spirits in the trees. It did not need Spanish soldiers or deadly curses. Human beings, when isolated, starving, and divided, can collapse all on their own. In this chapter, we peel back the final layer of the Roanoke mystery and examine the forces within the colony itself. Forces that crack a community from the inside long before any outside threat arrives. Because sometimes the greatest danger is not famine or conflict or the wilderness, but the slow unraveling of trust. Imagine the psychological pressure of living on a remote island thousands of miles from home in a world with no modern communication. Storms tearing at the roof, drought turning crops to dust, hunting parties returning empty-handed, children crying from hunger, loved ones falling ill with no doctor, no medicine, no understanding of why their strength vanishes. Then imagine the silence that comes after months of this. Silence so deep it feels like something pressing against your chest. Silence broken only by the wind and the occasional cry of an animal. Silence that makes every worry louder in your own mind. Isolation is not the absence of people. It is the absence of escape. No new faces, no reinforcements, no letters, no hope. Just the same group of people, straining under the same desperation, day after day, until stress becomes a physical presence in the settlement. Even the strongest communities fracture under such tension. And Roanoke was not a strong community. To understand the collapse, we must understand the colony's foundation. Roanoke was not built by farmers or soldiers.
It was built by tradesmen, artisans, families, and middle-class dreamers. Hard-working people, yes, but unprepared for the brutality of the New World. They were promised fertile land, friendly tribes, abundant resources, but those promises dissolved quickly. Instead of fertile land, drought. Instead of friendly tribes, shifting alliances. Instead of abundance, starvation. Instead of certainty, fear.
The colony's leadership was weak. John White, though well-meaning, was not a military commander. Nor was he a strategist. He was an artist, a mapper, a recorder, a man meant to document the New World, not tame it. And when he left for England, the settlement lost its last stabilizing force. The colony was left in the hands of ordinary people, forced to make extraordinary decisions. And the cracks widened. Diaries and letters from earlier voyages hint at the tensions simmering within the colonists. Disagreements over where to build, arguments about food distribution, disputes about whether to trust local tribes, accusations of hoarding, rumors of theft, suspicions that some settlers sabotaged others. These tensions are typical in frontier communities, but in Roanoke, isolation magnified them into fractures. One group wanted to leave the island. Another argued they should stay and wait for White. A third group feared the tribes more than starvation and wanted to fortify the settlement. A fourth group wanted to migrate inland. Each group believed the others were dooming them. And as fear grew, logic evaporated. In such conditions, even small conflicts ignite like tinder. Humans follow leaders when they believe in them. They follow each other when they trust in their unity. But when hope fades, leadership becomes brittle. Without John White, no one held absolute authority. Decisions were made through group discussions, arguments, and shifting alliances. A colony cannot survive long when no one agrees, no one decides, and no one leads. In the final months, Roanoke likely had not one leader, but many, and each pushed in a different direction.
And the colony splintered. Family groups made decisions independently. Friends chose sides. Tensions rose behind closed doors. Whispers turned into accusations. Accusations turned into isolation. People stopped working together. They stopped trusting one another. They stopped believing survival was possible unless they left, or left with the right group. The settlement didn't collapse in a moment. It crumbled slowly, like dry bark peeling from a dying tree. Human communities rely on shared goals, shared hope, and shared identity. Roanoke lost all three. Their identity as colonists meant nothing without England. Their shared hope died when no ships arrived. Their shared goals shattered when the drought worsened. Without a collective identity, the colonists reverted to the smallest unit of survival: families, friendships, small cliques, and personal loyalties. These small units began making their own survival plans. Some advocated joining the Croatoan people. Some argued for merging with inland tribes. Some wanted to build rafts and attempt a coastal voyage. Some wanted to forge deeper into the woods. Some believed leaving the settlement entirely was the only option. There is no record of a single decisive migration, because there likely wasn't one. There were many. The community didn't migrate. It dispersed. The moment a community stops thinking as we, it begins thinking as us and them. And us is never enough to survive. Fear is the most corrosive force in human society. Not fear of a known enemy, but fear of the unknown, the kind that hovers just outside the firelight, formless and constant. Roanoke was surrounded by unknowns, unknown animals, unknown tribes, unknown forests, unknown weather, unknown dangers, unknown future. Fear breeds suspicion. Suspicion breeds division. Division breeds collapse. The forest amplified every sound. The ocean carried whispers at night. The dryness of the air made crops crackle and die. And as hunger worsened, the colonists likely began blaming each other. Someone offended the tribes. Someone angered the spirits. Someone stole food. Someone whispered lies. Someone must be punished. Internal fear becomes a self-feeding fire. A community consumed by fear is already dead. It only needs time to vanish. At some point, perhaps after a series of disappearances or after another hunting party failed to return, a moment came when the colony realized something undeniable. Roanoke was no longer a place of survival, it was a place of death. They could remain and die slowly, or they could leave and die differently. Some chose Croatoan Island, some chose the forest, some chose inland tribes, some chose the coastline. One by one, small groups gathered what they could carry and slipped away. Children carried by tired mothers, weak fathers supported by neighbors, small bundles tied with rope, weapons slung over trembling shoulders. Not a mass exodus, not a single migration, but waves, weeks apart, families disappearing silently into the trees. No screams, no fights, just quiet decisions made in the dead of night. When John White returned, the settlement had not been abandoned at once. It had been abandoned incrementally, drained of life like water leaking through cracks. He saw the end of the story, but not the slow unraveling that preceded it.
Sociologists studying collapses of small groups identify a critical moment called the vanishing point. The moment when community cohesion collapses so thoroughly that people no longer act as a group. At the vanishing point, group identity dissolves. Individuals make private plans. Trust disappears. Coordination stops. People flee rather than fight. Leadership loses influence. Survival becomes individualized, and silence replaces cooperation. At this stage, disappearance becomes not only possible, but likely. A group that loses cohesion leaves no organized trail, no shared direction, no unified decision. It leaves only absence. Roanoke reached its vanishing point, and once that threshold was crossed, the colony's fate became inevitable. Picture the very last day. Not the day the colony fled, the day the last colonist left. A single family standing amid the dismantled houses, the wind lifting the edges of empty foundations, the fire pits grown cold, the paths overgrown, the silence absolute. They carved the word Croatoan, not for John White, for anyone who might come searching, for anyone who might still care. They look back once at the village, the place where they had hoped to build a future. Then they walk into the wilderness, not certain, not confident, just desperate. And the moment their footsteps disappear into the forest, Roanoke ceases to exist. Not with a bang, not with screams, not with battle, but with the quiet decision of human beings doing what humans have always done, trying to survive, and failing.
The disappearance was not supernatural. It was not a mystery. It was not a curse. It was something far more tragic. A community undone by the vulnerability of the human mind. Roanoke is a story of fear that became reality, hunger that erased identity, isolation that shattered unity, leadership that crumbled, hope that died, people who dispersed because they had no other choice. The most terrifying truth is not that Roanoke vanished mysteriously. The most terrifying truth is that Roanoke vanished just like any fragile human community does when put under unbearable pressure. Disappearance is not magic. It is the end of connection. And Roanoke lost its connections long before it lost its people. In the end, the mystery of Roanoke is not held in a single clue, or in the carved word left on a post, or even in the vanished bodies of the colonists themselves. It is held in the silence, a silence so deep it stretches across centuries, echoing through every abandoned settlement, every empty village, every place where human life once clung to the world and then dissolved into the air like breath in the cold. Tonight, we stand at the edge of that silence and face the simplest, most haunting possibility. The colonists of Roanoke did not die. They did not flee in terror. They did not disappear in a single event. They erased themselves, quietly, deliberately, and completely. A voluntary erasure, not out of cowardice, not out of madness, but out of a need to survive in a world that did not want them. This is the story of how a colony chose to stop being English and became something else entirely. When the English settled Roanoke, they believed they were planting the seeds of a new empire, a foothold on a vast continent, a claim marked by flags, timber walls, and baptismal records. But the land was not soft. The drought was merciless. The supply ships did not return, and the relationships with local tribes swung between alliance and hostility. As the months stretched into years, England's dream rotted in the soil, and something else took its place. A realization. The New World did not need them. It did not welcome them. It did not even acknowledge them. To survive, they would need to become part of the land, not rulers above it. This realization was too big, too frightening, too radical for the English mind to grasp. And yet, hunger softened rigid beliefs. Exhaustion rewrote values. Fear erased old loyalties. Slowly, the colonists began drifting away from the identity of English settlers and toward something new. In the years since John White's departure, the colony faced an unbearable truth. Remaining English would kill them. They couldn't survive on English crops that failed in the soil. They couldn't rely on English military support that never arrived. They couldn't maintain English houses against storms and erosion. They couldn't eat English rations that had long run out. But they could survive if they became something else. Indigenous tribes knew the land. They knew the rhythms of the seasons. They knew the plants that healed and the ones that poisoned. They knew how to move through forests silently, how to build homes that breathed with the wind, how to fish tidal currents, how to read the signs of weather,
The colonists chose to learn. Some families integrated with local tribes, some traded knowledge, some married into indigenous families, some adopted native customs. Others resisted, clinging desperately to their old identity. But hunger erases stubbornness faster than reason does. At some point, the moment forever lost to time, the colony crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer English. Not entirely, not anymore.
Modern archaeological evidence, oral histories, and scattered artifacts point to a single truth. Roanoke did not end in one moment. It ended gradually, in pieces. A family moving inland, a group adopting native shelter, a child carried into a Croatoan village, a starving man taken in by a tribe out of pity, two friends choosing different paths, a mother and father walking away from the settlement at dusk, knowing they would never return. At first, the colony wasn't disappearing. It was expanding outward in all directions, like roots searching for water. But roots, once separated, lose the strength of the tree. Within months, the colonists lost their cohesion, their unity, their identity. They became wanderers, guests, refugees, adopted children, strangers, finally, locals. By the time the last group prepared to leave the settlement, there was little left tying them to England. Their homes were worthless wood, their tools few, their hope long dead. What remained was survival. So they carved Croatoan, not as a cry for help, but as a final record of their direction. And then they stepped into the forest, following faint trails, carrying children on tired shoulders, guided by those who knew the land. Their last act was not an escape, it was a surrender, not to death, but to life.
The most chilling part of Roanoke's story is not that the colonists vanished. It's that they likely survived, and we have no idea who they became. Assimilation is a disappearance no graveyard records. When a colonist married into a tribe, their English name died. When a child learned a new language, their past dissolved. When the colonist adopted tribal dress, tribal tools, tribal customs, they shed the last visible trace of their Englishness. Within a single generation, the colony was gone, not physically, but culturally. No massacre necessary, no catastrophe, no supernatural force, just human adaptation at its most absolute. Archaeologists found European artifacts buried beside indigenous tools. They found English copper reworked into native jewelry. They found pottery with patterns combining two cultures. They found stories in tribal oral histories of pale-skinned people joining their communities. But these threads are faint, scattered, inconsistent, because the colonists did not remain as a group. They blended, they merged, they disappeared by becoming someone else. This is the erasure no one expected, a quiet, voluntary erasure. When John White returned after 3 agonizing years, he did not find bodies because there were none. He did not find chaos because there was none. He found order, quiet, deliberate order. The settlement dismantled, tools removed, homes taken apart with care, a message left without panic. Everything pointed not to catastrophe, but to choice. But White did not understand the choice.
He imagined rescue. He imagined Englishness preserved. He imagined his daughter waiting for him. He did not imagine a world where she would no longer need him, where she had found a new life, a new identity, a new community. He did not imagine her walking through the forest with people who knew the land better than he ever would.
He did not imagine Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, growing up not as English, but as Croatoan or Hatteras or one of the neighboring tribes. The tragedy is not that they vanished. The tragedy is that white arrived too late to see what they became. To him, the colony was missing. To themselves, they were reborn. Every theory we explored, famine, violence, the supernatural, the wilderness, holds truth. But none are complete alone. The real answer is a tapestry woven from all of them. Famine weakened them, isolation fractured them, fear splintered them, native alliances saved them, culture absorbed them, time erased them. Roanoke's fate was not dramatic, it was human. A community at the edge of extinction adapted, survived, changed, and then ceased to be recognizable. They did not vanish, they transformed. And what is transformation, if not a kind of disappearance?
Roanoke is not just a mystery of the past, it is a warning for the present. Communities still vanish, villages swept away by storms, towns abandoned after industry collapses, tribes erased by assimilation, cultures lost through globalization, people who disappear into new identities, entire groups who leave no record except silence. Disappearance is rarely sudden. It is a slow erosion, unnoticed until it is complete, just like Roanoke. The colony's final act was not a tragedy, it was a decision, one shaped by hunger, fear, culture, hope, and the primal instinct to survive at any cost. In choosing life over identity, they sacrificed the very thing history needed to remember them. Their story continues only because of its silence. We search for mysteries to solve them. We want answers. We want closure. We want the past to be neat and comprehensible. But Roanoke offers none of that. Instead, it offers something deeper, a mirror held up to humanity. A reminder that people change when pushed, that identity is fragile, that survival transforms us, that silence can be louder than screams, that disappearance does not require death, only change. And in that change, the colony slipped out of history's hands. Not because they vanished, but because they chose to walk into a future where England no longer defined them. A future the records would never capture. A future we can only imagine. A future that leaves us standing on an empty shore centuries later, staring at the same windswept trees John White once saw, asking the same question: where did they go? The truth is simple and haunting. They went everywhere and nowhere, all at once. They became the land. They became the people. They became the silence. And that silence, that deep, eternal, unfathomable silence, is the only trace they ever intended to leave behind.